Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending. This is a follow-on to a lecture I gave 2 years ago, which was about Egypt and in Roman Egypt, and talked more about the economy and its place in the empire, imperial trade, finance, a little bit of military, and that piqued my interest in, wait, what was really going on inside Egypt? What was life like for the Egyptians under Roman rule? And it was quite interesting. Did a lot of research, read a couple books, and did a lot of searching online, and ended up going to Egypt earlier this year with a number of our members here, and had a great time. And you'll see some of my pictures show up in the presentation. Daily life in Roman Egypt, and we're going to be talking about the different ethnic groups, in particular Egyptians, Greeks, Jews, and Romans, and how they affected life there. And we'll talk about some of the events, but with a little bit more focus on internal rather than external. Again, Rome took over Egypt when Cleopatra committed suicide, and Octavian, soon to become the Emperor Augustus, became the next pharaoh as far as anybody in Egypt was concerned in 30 BC. There's a slide from my previous lecture, just drawing the connection. Again, not a normal province, never was a normal province. It became a personal estate of the emperors. And you'll see why in a second on the next slide. Life went on, but Egypt was exploited for its wealth probably more than any other province in the empire. Grain fed 40,000 people in Rome off the dole, and a third of that came from Egypt. The city of Rome was able to grow thanks to a population of 1 million people, the first city in probably world history. Maybe Xi'an in China hit that, but first one in the West to hit 1 million people, again, thanks to grain coming in from various provinces, but principally Egypt. And then the gold and ivory and trade. First thing that happened was Octavian basically took over most of the wealth of the country, took 2/3 of the property of the richest people, took over the royal treasury, and he took most of the property from the temples and reorganized all of the temples and put them under central control. Rome was flooded with money. I won't go into that, but look down below. Initially, paid for about 1/3 of the imperial income. And later, by the end of the first century, by the end of Diocletian's reign, about 300 AD, 2/3 of the empire's income came out of Egypt. So again, point I made in previous lecture, no Egypt, no Roman Empire. Why do we know about what was going on inside Egypt? We got a lot of papyri, and the vast majority of them came from one location, Oxyrhynchus. And this was a city down in just south of the Delta. In 1896, these two people, Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt, that's them, left and right, Grenfell and Hunt, and they found over 500,000 papyri. The vast majority of those still remain to be translated, but the impact on our knowledge of Egypt and in fact the ancient world has been massive. Papyri, you've heard about papyri discovered across Egypt. This was the single largest cache. This was not in one place, this was all across the city, but they found so much. We're still going through it 125 years later. And we'll probably be going through it for another 100 would be conservative, let's say optimistic. We're going to be going through it for many, many, many more years. Most of this is at Oxford. Some of the work is being done in Giza, Alexandria. I know Harvard has some of this. What was found covered all aspects of life there: military documents, literature, drama, bills, public disputes, invites, legal works, slaves, arrests, The impacts on the Old Testament are great, the New Testament. And I'll have an example of party invite. The picture at the bottom is a picture of what the mound looked like when they found it. It's just basically the garbage mound, although they found stuff across the site. And the picture on the top is a scene of, that's not from Raiders of the Lost Ark, that's the dig at Oxyrhynchus recently. I wanted to point out one of the things that they found were works of Menander. In fact, they found 7 almost complete plays and fragments of 52 others. Why do we care? Because Menander had been quoted extensively, referred to extensively in other ancient works we had by Caesar, Cicero, various philosophers, various dramatists, correspondence. But we didn't have any of his works until we dug up Oxyrhynchus. Now we have his plays, we have fragments of others. He was very, very active. This is on the right-hand side, you can see what fragments of, that's a fairly extensive fragment. Down on the lower right side there, the little piece, that's a lot of what we got out of the digs. You probably have used some of the quotes from Menander and didn't know it. Have you ever said, only the good die young? Have you ever said, he who fights and runs away lives to fight another day? Have you ever said, let's call a spade, or talked about the die is cast? Or the way Colleen McCullough translated it, let the dice fly. I like that one. Here's another example, party invite. Terrace asks you to dinner. Again, over 5,000 fragments have been published. That's about 1 to 5% of the total. Like we said, there's 500,000. Most are the size of cornflakes. Here's 2 of Menander's pieces from, I'm sorry, here's two pieces from Oxyrhynchus that I photographed in the Alexandria Museum. On the left, Plato's some Homeric similes. On the right, extract of the first epistle of Paul to the Corinthians. These are important documents. There's a lot of biblical stuff, including a lot of the Gnostic Gospels, if you read about those. Gnostic Gospels are those things that were written, have been found recently, and we realize were not accepted into the Gospels in the Bible. Up at the top, there's an example of one of the papyri was an order, to Dion, please, when you go into the city next time, go find me 20 of Plato's dialogues, 4 of Xenophon, all you can find of Homer, Menander, Euripides, and Aristophanes. What does that mean? There was some real appreciation for ancient literature going on in ancient Egypt. Let's talk about the ethnic groups. Population was divided up. Legally and culturally, they were very separate. A leavening of Romans, very small chunk, probably started out 1%, not even, of the population, but it grew over time, particularly as demobilized soldiers decided Egypt was a good life and stayed. Greeks, who had ruled under the Ptolemaic dynasty until Cleopatra's death. Jews were a large part of the population, again, legally separate, and then the native Egyptians, which were the predominant part of the population. Intermarriage was common, but children took the lower status. That chart, where they're ranked on the left is how they were kind of ranked socially and legally. Next slide. The Romans, governor and staff, an army of about 20,000 men, and half of those were Roman citizens, and half were granted citizenship when they retired from the military after 25 years. Egyptians, for the first 100 plus years, were not allowed into the army, and later on they became, obtained the ability to join the military. A few traders and businessmen running a high impact things, trade with the Indian Ocean, overseeing the important grain shipments coming down the Nile, tax collecting in Alexandria, and then shipment overseas. A few of the Alexandrian families did obtain citizenship. You had to basically earn it. And then again, Romans were exempt from taxes, had a lot of privileges. And of course, they were resented by all of the other groups in Egypt, resented very badly in many cases. They were in the cities, some settled in large villages, some became local benefactors, but they did flaunt their privileges and their tax exemptions. When they were exempted from taxes, the locals got to pay them. And there was a little bit of arrogance, and they were contemptuous of the locals in many ways. Not good, and we'll talk about what that caused later. The army was spread out across Egypt. It was really an army of occupation. The map there shows major fortresses down near Aswan, Thebes, of course, Luxor. I'll have a picture of that. Then there were minor fortresses, Babylon, the old near Memphis, and then Alexandria and Pelusium, the two gateways to the Delta from east and west. Minor forts include across the country, and of course they patrolled the trade routes and the oases. This is an extract from the Notitia Dignitatum, which listed where all the units were in about the year 420 AD. I just throw that up as an example, not going to talk to them very much. Map was included in the versions that came down to us. That's how they saw the Nile. You can see Philae up at the top, so you're looking kind of from the north towards the south at the top. A quick discussion of the military units. Equitums or equites were cavalry units. Each of these units has about 500 men, maybe up to 1,000 at the time. Sagittarii were archers. The legios were infantry. Alas were cavalry. Notice the ones I put in red are dromedarodorium. Those are camels, dromedaries. That's a cavalry unit of camels. Very important for patrolling the desert paths. The one I also highlighted in red there, cataphractid. The cataphracts were extremely heavily armored cavalry, which must have been absolutely miserable to be in the summer in Egypt. I doubt they wore their armor very much. And then again, cohorts at the bottom were, again, infantry. Interestingly, according to the records we found, except for the units that were just garrisoning cities, the units that were out anywhere on the edges and had to run patrols out into the desert would have small detachments of camels attached to them, and the infantrymen or the cavalrymen would switch over and ride the camels out into the desert to run their patrols. It was maybe 10, 20 camels per unit of 500 men. This is the Lower Egypt garrison. Again, look at a few of them are in the oases. And again, it's sort of spread out. A lot of cavalry in the garrison. Why? You can patrol large areas and you can rush to put down revolts in areas. Again, cohorts and legions are infantry, equites and allies are cavalry. Some of us have been here. I was there earlier this year. The temple in Luxor was converted into a fortress, and it is the main fortress for the central Egypt. Quite a legion was stationed there. There were probably multiple units nearby, and this was how they exerted control. The fortress walls have been eliminated, and now we can see the temple more the way it looked in pharaonic times. And there's very little of the Roman era left, except there are a few areas that are painted. Okay, up on the wall there, down in the lower left, is the back area became a church later on, and so there's some church worship scenes. Next ethnic group, the Greeks. Officially, to legally be a Greek, you had to live in one of three cities initially and be called a metropolites, Alexandria, Naucratis, and Ptolemais. Later, Annapolis was built when Hadrian's favorite died, Antinous, and if you were a resident of one of those cities and you were Greek, then you were considered Greek. If you were Greek anywhere else, you were considered an Egyptian. That created a lot of resentment. The Greeks didn't like that at all. In Naucratis and Ptolemais, there were allowed a bulla, which was a local government. So they were allowed, the bulla was a city council, and they were allowed to run things. Alexandria, despite being the largest city, the second largest city in the empire, and the largest city in Egypt, was not allowed to form a bulla. Why? Caesar was upset at the Alexandrians. They had fought him. Augustus was upset at them. Every ruler thereafter was irritated and infuriated by the Alexandrians. Part of it was their wit. Part of it was their tendency to riot, whether against the Romans or against each other, neighborhood against neighborhood, ethnic group against ethnic group, or part of it was just these people won't cooperate. Finally, in about 200 AD, they were allowed a bulla and were allowed a city council. Again, Greeks outside the cities were Egyptians, despite the fact that they didn't try to be Egyptians. They tried to keep up their Greek culture. They read literature. They were in gymnasiums. They did everything Greeks do, but they were treated legally as Egyptians. And then there was the Jews. They were allowed their own laws and customs. Again, that irritated the Greeks in Alexandria. Why do they get a council and we don't? That's because you're always rioting and rebelling. And you're always being very, very disrespectful to the emperors. There were synagogues in every major city. And Elephantine down south, those are pictures of Elephantine. Why was it called Elephantine? Because the big gray boulders kind of look like elephants in the water. Jewish mercenary Garrison was there, served under the pharaohs and later under the Ptolemies. So Aswan was known for having, Elephantine is right next to Aswan. It's an island out in the Nile. And it was known to have a large Jewish population. Just as a side note, the brown building in the lower right picture is the Cataract Hotel. That's where Death on the Nile was written during a vacation. And then the Egyptians. In a lot of ways, things never changed for the Egyptians. If you're a peasant in Egypt, your life maybe doesn't look that different today than it looked 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. But who was Egyptian? Again, legally anyone not Roman, Jewish, or Greek. Interestingly, they did provide the priesthoods, both for Egyptians and Roman temples. And the Egyptian priesthood was active into the 100s, and we'll talk about some of the things that lasted even longer than that. Egyptians were not allowed to purchase public land if it was ever put up for sale. Farmers owned or leased their land. Interestingly, they had to pay 5 years at a time for a lease, and it was paid in advance. So to be a farmer took a little bit of an investment. Farming was paid labor. Slaves existed. Almost everybody had slaves, but they were limited to domestic work or large industrial concerns like a brewery or a brickmaking factory or not hurting animals, that's agricultural, large concerns, large industrial stuff. And then the Metropolitan Days. Let's talk about what life was like in the cities and the villages. There were about 30 or 40 towns that had 30,000 people or more. Oxyrhynchus and Arsinoe were best known. Let's use Oxyrhynchus as the example. We've already brought them up because of the papyri found. Picture on the upper right is a sketch from the late 1800s when Grenfell and Hunt showed up. Probably looked like this. It still had the colonnaded street, Main Street, going through the town. That's kind of gone now. You know, how things get stripped over time and used as building materials for other things, even in the 1900s. Colonnaded street, 3 baths, a hippodrome for chariot races, 20 temples, synagogue, churches, bank, gymnasium, theater, all the essentials for Greek cultural life. And then combined with that, running water 24/7 throughout the city. A council of elders, free grain dole, which they were not required to do, but they decided to do, and hieroglyph cutters. By the 200s, the Greekness started to break down. Again, we talked about intermarriage. And in 212, the Emperor Karakola, who was, we'll talk a little more about him, he was really a beast, but he extended a citizenship to all free people in the empire, which was great, but it then meant everybody was kind of all the same. After that, you start seeing Egyptian names showing up in the gymnasium applications. For a gymnasium application, you had to show 5 generations of Greek ancestry. And the gymnasium was more than just a place to work out, although it certainly was that. It was also where school was held. It's also where you went to meet tutors. It's also where you went for lectures by philosophers. So the gymnasium was sort of the heart, along with the theaters and the temples, of Greek culture in cities. So you had to show 5 generations, and we start seeing Egyptian names showing up. Yeah, I've got 5 generations of Greek forefathers, even though my name is not Greek. Local officials took their titles from Athens, and in fact, the language kind of came from Athens. Across the Near East, outside of Greece, the Greek that was spoken was called Koine, Koine, was sort of the Athenian dialect, which was sort of modified and simplified and became what was spoken across the Hellenistic world, the area that Alexander the Great had conquered and was divided up by his generals and successors. In fact, if you take ancient Greek right now, for instance, up at CU Boulder, Koine is the form of Greek that they teach. Important comment there is look at the liturgies. All of these offices had to pay any of their expenses out of their own pocket. It did result in a lifetime honorific, the sometime gymnasiarch, Dion. So that was how you got to be addressed for the rest of your life. That's great. But now you're out a chunk of change for having been a benefactor for where there was a gymnasium, training men, or what selling, you know, the administrative expenses of leasing out the stalls, getting scribes, getting inspectors, etc. It became harder to fill offices as the economy ground down over time. And one of the constant themes in Egyptian history under Rome was the economy did sort of grind down over time. The ancient world had no sense of economics. There was no theory, no of how economies are supposed to work. They didn't have, yeah, they had banks, but they were kind of rudimentary. Yeah, they had trade, certainly, and yeah, they had rich people and they had money, but they really didn't understand what made economies go up and down, and the constant outflow of wealth from Egypt had its impact over the decades and centuries. Eventually, there was a bulla in each known capital, each province, but they didn't have a legislative authority. Rome would not surrender that. The prefect of Egypt, who was based in Alexandria, the governor, if you will, retained all authority. Guidance all came from the emperor through the prefect. And again, no Senate, no nothing, not even the Senate in Rome. It was not run as part of the empire responsible to the Senate. Again, this was all the emperor's personal property. So what did the bulla do? They did the festivals, and they may have helped out on the taxes a little bit. What was ancient work like? Well, I won't read all those. Everything you can imagine that would have happened in the ancient world was happening in Egypt. Of course, I know. Interesting, desert charge. We do have a record that prostitutes were charged 108 drachmas, whereas a normal person was charged maybe something like 10 or 20. There had been a thought that earlier by historians that this was an attempt to get rid of prostitution, but Roman law never made moral choices. They didn't try to do things like that. So in retrospect, this was more simply a way to get more money. Agriculture, same animals we see in pharaonic times in general. Horses were limited to being raised for the army or the wealthy. Pigs, which were big in Egypt at the time. Jews and Egyptians thought it was unfit. The Romans made it acceptable, and eventually the Egyptians started eating it too. The Jews never did. Interestingly, what I learned while in my research, the olive oil, best quality stuff was used for the body rubs. You know, when you were in the gymnasium and got your rub down after your workout or after the baths, you got the highest quality olive oil. Medium, you ate. Poor stuff went into. The economy was heavily monetized, which is interesting. I usually don't think of Egypt that way. It had a separate money system, though, than the rest of the empire. They used their own coinage and would exchange it for then Roman coinage for trade or at the border points, mostly Alexandria, or to go overseas. So the two live side by side. We see this in some places which are, for instance, British possessions. Gibraltar has a different pound, but it's exchangeable with the British pound. There's an example of one of the gentry we found out about, Serapium. He moved in, owned vineyards, pastures, fields of crops, leased land out to other small farmers, had 1,000 sheep and goats, and he loaned out money at 1% interest per month, which is pretty reasonable for that era. The villages, lots of poor people, as always. The peasants always kept doing what they were doing and what some of them are still doing. Largely a barter economy, and then they would sell some to get the cash for taxes. Grain was also considered a tax sometimes, so they would do that produce. Interestingly, when you took out a loan for grain, you then seed corn, if you will, you owed another 50% back to the grain bank. And the landlord that you leased the land from owned the grain until you paid the rent. Most of the people were illiterate, but would try to get education for their sons, upward mobility, whether into the priesthood or into the ranks of the semi-Greeks and then the Greeks, which of course, as we just said, were also legally Egyptians. Previously, we had learned that in previous lectures that you were considered Greek if you had a Greek education. So yeah, you couldn't get into the gymnasium if you had unless you had 5 generations of Greek antecedents. But if you got a good Greek education, even though you came from you were an Egyptian from an Egyptian village, you would pass for Greek, and you'd be Greek in the town, Greek in the city. You might have to get out of the village. We'll talk a little bit about wages here and coming up. 4 drachma per day paid a skilled laborer. 2 drachmas rented a donkey, 3.5 for sheavers. You'd pay less for the boy driver. But let's talk about some of the other things. Entertainers got paid a lot more. Festivals, they would send to cities for entertainers. One papyri says, I wish to employ 3 castanet dancers for 6 days. I'm going to pay 12 drachmas per day a piece, and food. But look down below. For that same festival, you could get 496 drachmas for one of the actors, or 448 for a reciter of Homer. As an example, I'm sure the rates fluctuate. Athletes, well, just any similarity today is totally intentional. Athletes were paid outrageous fortunes. One boxer went undefeated for 100 plus fights. 14 cities, including Alexandria and Annapolis, made him a citizen. He was given a pension of 180 drachmas per month. That was 3 times a soldier's pension. And I love this quote we found. There was a union of athletes, boxers and wrestlers, and I don't know if the charioteers were part of it, but the Sacred Society of Worldwide Traveling Victorious in Sacred Games Gold Crown Artists, dedicated to Dionysus and our Lord Trajan, or whichever emperor was going then. And they got priority seating, they got tax exemptions, they got all kinds of exemptions. Was that useful? Was it great? Yeah. So if you were living in a village, what did you want to do? You at least wanted to learn how to dance. If you couldn't dance, you wanted to memorize Homer. And if you couldn't do those, and you were light and little, like me maybe, you wanted to be in a chariot. Why chariots? The fortunes for chariot racers were outstanding. One chariot racer was found to have, in a 24-year career, amassed 1.5 million drachmas. That comes out to something like averaging 64,000 drachmas per year. That is quite a bit more than regular people. And again, think pro athletes today, especially those that sign for $10, $20 million contracts. Of course, he wasn't making that much at the beginning necessarily. I'm sure it had its ups and downs, but that was what he was reported to have made in the course of his career. What was going on in between the races? Well, everything. Between races wasn't just let's wait for the next race. There would be dancing, there'd be reciting, whether it was plays or Homer or drama. There would be music, there'd be mimes, you name it. There was some sort of entertainment in between the racing events. And violence, not necessarily between the charioteers, like in the movie Ben-Hur, but the crowds like to fight each other. The Blues and Greens were the two groups that backed teams, think fan groups. And the Blues and Greens like to come to blows over their teams. And also it could be more, not necessarily ethnic, but city or village type. Hey, let's go to town and let's cause a ruckus over when the next chariot races come in on Saturday. That happened a lot. Any resemblance to high school football games in some places? Yes. Let's talk about the families. Incestuous marriages. Like I like to say, they're not just for pharaohs anymore. Historians, as they were started to translate papyri that they found, when they found writings that referred to somebody's sister wife, they thought that was just an honorific. Yeah. They weren't really marrying their sisters. And then they realized later on, they found more papyri that said, my sister wife from my same mother and father. And finally, the historians caved in and said, yeah, they were marrying their siblings. Very common, both Egyptian and Greeks don't have a quantification, 1/3 to 1/5 of the population maybe of the marriages were siblings. Roman law prohibited the marriage to siblings and aunts. Nieces were okay. The history rule of thumb, like we said, if there's a law, it's because people were doing it and you had to outlaw it. Let's skip to education. Boys started about age of 10, some girls, and then maybe high school, college equivalent was to go to Alexandria, and I'll give you an example, some of those classrooms later. There was a preference for males. Unwanted Greek children too often were exposed. A lot of times these were girls. just because of male preference that we see in lots of cultures. There was also disfigured children might be left exposed. An example as simple as two fused fingers. A lot of times they were rescued and raised by Egyptians. There was a cultural taboo against death and a religious taboo. And later on, Christians as well would start doing this. They became usually they were raised as slaves, taught weaving, shorthand, or to work in the factories we talked about. There was a name actually set them apart. They were named of the dunghill, Copra Dia. Something I'm sure to get over. I like the family picture there. Maybe a little more modern since it's photographed, but census was every 14 years. Found that the average was 2 to 3 children. You could have 5 normally, and a couple slaves. Marriage was largely common law. There could be temple ceremonies for the more wealthy or more socially prominent. There was one example family, and I want to talk about this for a second. The husband was 50, his sister wife was 54. 4 sons, ages 29 to 9, and a daughter 7. The eldest son had 1-year-old twin sons. There were 3 nephews in the family, for ages 43 to 19. The eldest had a wife and a 1-year-old daughter. There was a 44-year-old in the family, don't know who he was associated with. The guess is the baby's maternal grandfather and his 52-year-old wife. So notice the wives were older in both cases, and their 8-year-old son. 3 brothers, 52 to 26, of the second son's wife, and a 23-year-old wife sister again of the youngest brother. So there are 4 wives referred to there, and 3 of them are sister wives. And in 2 of the cases, the women are having babies in their 40s. So sign of good nutrition and decent medical care. Now, ancient lifespans, child attrition is quite high. Child mortality was quite high. And so it was kind of surprising that we not only had people living into their 50s here in this family, but also that they were having children in their 40s. Like I said, sign of good nutrition, sign of good raising, healthy. That comes to a grand total of 17 adults and 7 children. And in the census, they were declared to be living in 1/10 of a townhouse. Don't know the circumstances, if it was a really big townhouse or if it was simply their mailing address, if you will. And there was an interesting mailing system in Roman Egypt. You could give a letter to somebody and you would have directions, and they did not have street names and address numbers like we do. Instead, it would be directions. Go down the main street, take a left at the fountain, go down to the 3rd house on the right, go upstairs, walk down a hallway, and the 4th red door is where to deliver the mail to. We talked about mixed ethnic marriages. Happened all over the place. Again, we talked about Egyptians applying to gymnasiums with Greek antecedents. The law about treating mixed children was, again, they become the lower legal ethnic group. But we're seeing increased syncretism over time of cultural melding together. Here's a couple of examples. That's Stele of Caius Valerius Rufus, Roman name. On the right, he has a Roman Greek dress. It's child tombstone. Egyptian side lock for a youth. Egyptian religious themes there on the side. Roman clothes, Roman name, and a Greek text underneath. One of my pictures from the catacombs in Alexandria is the middle picture there. Anubis in a Roman army uniform. The catacombs are fantastic, by the way. And on the far left, Anubis in a Roman Greek outfit, looking very different than he looks in Egyptian art. And that was actually carted away from Egypt and ended up in Tivoli, outside Rome, Hadrian's Villa. Property ownership can get incredibly complex. There was just this massive cross-hatched matrix of who owned land. There were imperial estates, temples, absentee Romans would buy property. They lived in Rome, or they lived in Gaul, or they lived in Greece. Again, land was leased to peasants. They had to bid on it. Middlemen frequently took the bid on the land and then subleased it out. Inheritances, purchases, marriages, dividing among children. It got very complicated. Again, from one papyri, one man, he owned 1/12 of an empty lot, 1/6 of a house and a courtyard. I love this part, 43 240ths of a house and courtyard, a quarter of an ora of land, think an acre, and 1 3/8 ora elsewhere. I don't know if Egypt is that much divided up today, but this was incredibly complex, and they kept track of it. Again, that's why they had so much writing and so many papyri. Taxes, crushing. Taxes were crushing in Roman Egypt. It was originally tax farmed. One guy went over quota. The prefect was actually chastised by Tiberius. I want my sheep sheared, not skinned alive. There was still an annual requirement to work the dikes and canals 5 days a year, but the quota was by quantity of earth you had to move. And of course, whenever there's bureaucracy, there's bribery, and people did bribe the officials to try to get out of the work. I thought it was also interesting that the poll taxes vary. Anywhere from 8 to 20 drachmas. Arsinoe was the most expensive at 20 drachmas per year. Not a killer for a skilled laborer, that's 5 days of work, but that was only one of the 100+ taxes that they had to pay. Oh, by the way, the pig tax. Why was there a pig tax? Because they needed pigs for the sacrifices in the Roman temples. Farms were often abandoned. Lots of people, I read over and over again how the taxes got so heavy, along with the rent that had to be paid that was coming up in one big chunk. And so a lot of times people would abandon. But unfortunately, what that caused was your neighbors then had to till that land and had to send those taxes in, because the emperor was going to get his due no matter what. And they became outlaws. They hid, they took fake names, they went to the cities, maybe they went to another province. I don't know what happened to the families, if they went with them or not, but the farmers ran. And periodically, the prefect had to issue an amnesty. Okay, I'll come free, everybody goes back, you can have your land back. And but typically the ones who fled were fleeing the more marginal farmland that were having trouble with trying to meet the taxes. So the other farmers having to take over and till that land, in addition to their own, did not make them happy. Amnesties were well received until the Antonine Plague, 160 to 185. It hit the whole empire. The empire population reduction across the empire was probably 25%. Thought it to be smallpox brought back by the army after a campaign in Persia, and it hit the whole empire. It spread, again, 25% mortality rate. You know, we're complaining about our pandemic with its 1% of the people, like 1 to 2% of the people that get it, and it's nothing like it. The villages, a lot were wiped out, and the empire and Egypt never fully recovered. The economy was never the same. The culture was never the same. So again, this kind of goes back to the syncretism and the melding together of the cultures. The people had to pull together after the Antonine Plague. And of course, revolts. I won't go into all of them. I'll let you just look at some of those dates. One thing I found going through those, if you live to the ripe old age of 50 or 60 in Egypt, you lived through a major rebellion or revolt. They just came too close together. For some of the major ones, lots of life and lots of property destruction. Karakola, as I said, he was a total beast. He massacred 5,000 Alexandrian youth after luring them out of the city, promising them that he was going to create a special legion for them. And they were all happy and volunteered and took them out to the desert at the edge of the city and killed them all. Then he went off and killed a whole bunch of the rich people in the town, and then he continued the massacre. The 297 revolt actually lasted 18 months, started down by Thebes, and then involved a siege of Alexandria. So basically all of Egypt was in revolt. Diocletian, the emperor, came in with a massive army from outside, did an 8-month siege. When he finally got into the city, told his army, kill them all until the blood is up to my horse's knees. And the blood started flowing in the streets, and his horse stumbled, and he got blood up to his knees. And Diocletian saw this as a sign from a god and ordered the massacre to stop. The people were so grateful for that, and then the grain that he diverted to Alexandria afterwards because of the famine. So shipping grain into Egypt or extracting it from the taxes that were of grain that were supposed to leave Egypt and leaving in Alexandria because of the famine instead. I'm not sure what she did, but they raised what's now called Pompey's Pillar, inaccurately called Pompey's Pillar, in gratitude to him. And they also raised a statue in gratitude to his horse. Imperial visits, just part of the massive tourism that was going on. Rich Romans, Greeks would come from across the empire to visit the sites in Egypt. It was something everybody had to do then, like today. Hadrian's visit with his wife made history. It was a very unhappy marriage because he brought along his favorite, I'm doing air quotes, Antinous, along with him. And he spent 10 months in Egypt. Antinous ended up drowning in the Nile. There are ancient historians, there were actually a few people that questioned how he died. Didn't just drown by falling off the boat, but was he pushed? Was it another favorite? Was it somebody vying for attention? But Hadrian liked him so much, he deified him and built Annapolis. And the picture there is what's left, not much. He spent 6 days, reported, waiting to hear the Colossi of Memnon sing. That's them in the lower right. And they did. He had to get there at dawn every day, he and Sabina and Antinous. And again, they requisitioned what they needed, and it could be quite expensive. Somebody was out a lot of animals and a lot of feed. Septimus Severus also spent 2 days waiting to hear the Colossi. On the second day, he did hear the Colossi sing at dawn. And as you may have known, the Colossi sang when the rays of dawn hit it, and because of the temperature difference for the cold stone inside and the air warming outside, the air rustling through created a moan or a song. Why named Memnon? Because Memnon was the Ethiopian king who went to Troy in the Iliad, or not the Iliad, after the Iliad, one of the other epics, went to Troy, and he was the daughter of Aurora, the dawn. And so they named this the Colossi of Memnon, calling to his mother. Karakola's visit. Karakola was Septimus Severus' son. Again, a beast. He killed his son he killed his brother, Geta, to take over the throne by himself. He was already going to be emperor, but he wanted to be singular emperor rather than co-emperor. His visit is the last reference we have to Alexander's tomb. It was still in place. His father, Septimus Severus, had actually stopped the tourists from visiting it because he thought they were overwhelming it and ruining Alexander's tomb in Alexandria, the Soma. and so he closed it off to visitors. The son did visit it. He actually left an offering there, his own cloak and sandals and some other things as a offering to Alexander. He thought of himself as the new Alexander. But again, he was just a beast and an animal, and he killed a lot of people out of cruelty. Pictures across the bottom, Septimus Severus on the left, Karakola next, and Diocletian in the middle, and again, Colossi of Memnon on the right. Diocletian also visited Philae. We'll talk about that, fortified it as part of the new border. Let's talk about Alexandria as a very special place and kind of an example, but also not the example because it was so special, of entertainment, riots, witty put-downs, their disrespect for the emperor and for the prefect and for anybody else and for each other was well known. Again, here's Pompey's pillar at the Serapium, the Temple of Serapis, and which later on became the daughter library of the main library of Alexandria, model of what they think it looked like on the lower left. Replica of the Apis bull there in the catacombs underneath. The replica is there. The original was found there and was moved to the museum. And on the right, you can see they called it catacombs. You can't fit bodies in those little niches. So now people think that those niches were where the scrolls were kept in the library. And that's Marwa, my tour guide for when I was in Alexandria. She was a wonderful tour guide. I owe her a lot. Archaeology Park in the middle of the town, in the city of Alexandria. They've started digging up some of the old city from the Roman era. And you can see the colonnaded street, like the drawing of Alexandrinus earlier. And the middle picture and the picture on the left are the Archaeology Park. We'll talk about in a second. The row of little square buildings, not buildings, rooms behind the columns there across the street from the columns are classrooms. Again, we talked about how you went to Alexandria for finishing, for your boarding school, away school, college, high school equivalent. Those were where you went. The big red mound in the background was the baths. And I'll show you off to the right was a theater. The lower right-hand picture is a new dig, actually, and current dig that is at the Shahalat Gardens. Greek archaeologist, nice lady, Calliope Limnios Papakosta, has been digging there for 14 years, and she recently got down to street level. If you can make out the little white stones that are in sort of an L shape down at the bottom of the ruins there, that's the street level. Those are street pavers. I hate to say this, but to quote a Indiana Jones movie, they're digging in the wrong place, I think, because the main streets actually meet behind where I took this picture from, about 150 yards behind us. And I think that would have been the location. I'll be happy to be surprised. I'll be happy if she finds this. But if it took her 14 years to get this far in this corner of the gardens, I hope she lives a very long life to spend the next 28 years and get to the other side of the gardens. Unless she finds something before then, that'd be wonderful. Again, I owe Marwa. I got this picture because I climbed through a very open fence and figured that the big opening made the no entry sign null and void. And a policeman came, and she was able to talk him out of me getting in trouble. And so that was nice. Here's the theater. Again, Marwa was walking down the steps towards it. That's the end of the colonnaded street. And it's from the Roman period, but it looks like a Greek theater. Again, the culture there was largely Greek. If you've ever been in a movie theater and had to find your seat in row A32, we didn't invent that. There's the Roman Greek period had seats numbering 2. Up the left are gammas, over on the right are deltas and betas. I'm not sure what that one in between is, but yeah, the seats were numbered in Roman Greek theaters. That theater held, the estimate is 200 to 300 people. So it was not a huge theater, but it was nice, tight, intimate for events. There's a picture of the classrooms on the left, the auditoria, and on the sides, the students would sit, and at the back is a raised seat for the instructor to then expound and provide wisdom to the students. There again, a lot of classrooms here. I want to say there was about 8 or 10. On the right-hand side of the baths, the main baths were up above. This is the entrance to the boilers down below to heat the baths. And right nearby, just 30, 40 yards away, started the villas. And this is one they've dug up. They've enclosed it to protect it. And it's called the Villa of the Birds because of the beautiful mosaics, the gorgeous birds. This really hit me. Wouldn't that be luxurious living, to live in a house and be walking on mosaics with that kind of quality? And right next to the University District, right next to the theaters, right next to the baths, you had everything close. We'll finish up by going down to Philae. Philae is how I learned at a website how to pronounce it. Again, this is the island that was just nearby Aswan, near the modern border of Egypt. And it was a temple going way back into pharaonic times, but the Romans and the Greeks kept it up. Septimus Severus, as I said, fortified it. The building in the middle is called Trajan's Kiosk. It's actually unfinished, but it is just a gorgeous little building that is reported to be one of the most objects of artwork of paintings and sketches in Egypt. Gorgeous island. This is, if not my favorite, it's one of my favorite places in Egypt. Lower right-hand side is a picture of some of my favorite people. Some of you are here in the lecture. Thank you very much for attending. And they're taking pictures of something, and let's talk about that. It's called the Graffito Vestmed Akam. It is the last recorded hieroglyphs carved anywhere in Egypt. On the left-hand side are the hieroglyphs. There's my real picture of it, and there's an internet transliteration of it, and then down below is the translation, and the right-hand side is the Modic, related to the same thing. Why did they stop carving hieroglyphs? As I said, back in Oxyrhynchus, they had hieroglyph carvers on the city employment. So it wasn't just a Greek city, they were doing hieroglyphs too for the temples and for maybe for science, don't know. But why 394? Well, Emperor then, Theodosius, was a very Orthodox Christian and was doing his best to try to stamp out all the pagan religions. So the Egyptian temples were being suppressed. Pagan of any sort were being suppressed. So all of the Serapis temples were going away, basically. And this was this was the last hurrah. I wrote this, the last words. I think they outlawed anything but Christian churches just a few years later, about very early 400s. And all of the temples, if they did survive, began turning into Christian churches. Coptic crosses defaced the gods and the pharaohs. You can see the cross there on the far left of the left-hand picture. There's one on the left-hand side of the column there on the right. And you can see on the right-hand side how and on the pictures on the left too, they started carving out the pictures of the gods and the pharaohs. There will be no pagans in a church. And we see that across Egypt during the Coptic period, lots of defacing of old time churches, temples. And we'll leave this period in ancient Egypt. As we move into the Christian era, Christians took over Egypt. In fact, became known as a center of Christianity. If you ever read any of the works of the saints, a lot of them are set in Egypt. Anthony is a big one. Paul is another one. Monks read these, priests read these when they go to seminary. Lots of readings. Sometimes they settled up in forts. They lived on, manna from heaven, if it were. A lot of delusions, a lot of spiritual awakenings. And on the left, in the middle there is a picture of all of the little Christian small communities for hermits and ascetics. That's across the Natron Valley, which is now turned into a very agricultural area. I don't know if it still looks like that. And down below, you can see where that is in the map on the left. Very close and tight together, men and women, all those working in different ways. Think of it like a whole bunch of little monasteries. So to sum up, if you do go to Egypt, don't forget the Greeks and the Romans. The Greeks ruled for 300 years, the Romans for 600 years, almost 700, and be on the lookout for them. Again, more pictures of my favorite people in the boat there. And on the lower left, I think that's Bob Rushford there in the ball cap and the green jacket. I think I saw Bob was joining us here. We were together on a lot of our tour. There's Marwa with me down in the upper left in the catacombs of Alexandria. Ahmed in the lower two pictures, who was with us across Aswan and Thebes and Cairo. And it was just a wonderful time. Again, if you go, it's more than just pharaohs. With that, I'll go ahead and end, and we'll open it up for questions and answers.